Sometimes you can practically feel things changing right in front of you. And that's what it feels like right now with these ATACMS missiles showing up in Ukraine. We're talking game changer stuff, weapons that can hit targets hundreds of miles away.
Yeah, it's really striking how much attention these missiles are getting.
Mm.
It's not just about their military capabilities, but the message they send, what it means that the U.S. is supplying them. I mean,
Right. It's way more than just military strategy. I mean, some experts are saying we're closer to a potential nuclear conflict than we've been in decades.
yeah, like holding a match to a powder keg.
Exactly. I was reading an article by
Oh, I saw that one too.
They compared it to holding a match to a powder keg. They argued that giving Ukraine this kind of firepower could push Russia into a corner, and that makes a drastic response more likely.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what Putin's thinking over in the Kremlin.
So let's get into the specifics of these ATACMS. You've been looking into the technical side of things. What makes these so different from other weapons Ukraine's been using?
Well, imagine trying to hit a target from miles away with pinpoint accuracy. That's what these ATCMS can do. These long-range, precision-guided missiles can let Ukraine strike deep behind enemy lines, hitting targets that were out of reach before.
So some of the reports you shared described how Russia has these big supply depots and command centers far from the front lines. If those become vulnerable,
Exactly. It disrupts everything for them. Think about crippling logistical hubs, cutting off supply lines, even taking out key military infrastructure like air bases. It changes the entire dynamic.
that makes sense. But I'm also seeing these reports about Russia seeing this as a major escalation. They're not just going to sit back and watch this happen, are they?
Definitely not. Russia actually updated their nuclear doctrine in response to the West supporting Ukraine. And there's this one line that's chilling. They now say that any attack from Ukraine using U.S.-supplied weapons, specifically naming ATCMS, could justify a nuclear response from them.
That's a scary thought. It feels like we're stepping back into the Cold War with both sides waiting for the other to make a move.
It's definitely got some parallels to the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're seeing how miscalculations and perceived threats can bring things to the brink of unthinkable consequences.
It makes you wonder what's going on in Putin's head. Is he really willing to risk a nuclear war over this?
That's the big question, isn't it? There are a few different thoughts on this. Some analysts think Putin is being careful, calculating every move, trying to project strength without starting a nuclear war. They say his restraint so far shows he has a plan.
But others are saying it'd be a mistake to underestimate him. I mean, look at how he talks. He's always reminding everyone about Russia's nuclear weapons.
You're right, and his recent statement that Russia is ready to use all means to protect its territory is not very comforting. That kind of ambiguity is what keeps everyone on edge. Is he bluffing or is he serious? It's almost like,
He's playing poker with the fate of the world at stake.
exactly. Every move, every word is carefully planned to make him look strong and test the West's limits. But remember, just like in poker, bluffs can be called and the consequences can be devastating.
Speaking of big decisions, I'm curious about what's happening within the U.S. government. Is everyone on board with sending these ATACMS? This is a huge gamble.
That's where things get a little unclear. From what you shared, it sounds like there were some pretty intense discussions in the Biden administration before they decided to send the missiles. Some key military advisors were saying it was too risky, that the chance of things escalating was too high.
But Blinken and Sullivan, the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, they were in favor of sending the missiles. Why?
It seems their argument was that Ukraine really needed these long-range weapons to break the stalemate in the fighting and hopefully force Russia to negotiate.
So maybe there are some cracks in the idea of a united front. What does this disagreement tell us about the U.S.'s long-term plan and their ability to handle this situation?
That's a good question, and it brings us to another big part of this whole thing, the effect on the balance of power globally. It's not just two superpowers facing off anymore.
Right, you're talking about other players getting involved, countries like China and India, watching everything very closely and deciding whose side they're on. It's not just a regional conflict anymore, is it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
This feels like a turning point where the old rules are changing. We're moving toward a multipolar world where power isn't so concentrated and the traditional alliances are being tested.
And how do these new players see the situation in Ukraine? Do they see it as just a local thing or something bigger?
Well, that's where things get interesting. In Name of Publications analysis, they said that. Countries like China and India see this whole thing differently. They're not really picking sides, but they're definitely thinking about what's best for them.
So it's more about what they can get out of it. What are their interests specifically, and how are they using this situation to their advantage?
Well, for China, it's about challenging the U.S. They want to be the top dog on the world stage, and they see this conflict as a way to get closer to Russia and show they're a real alternative to the West.
And what about India? They've always been close to Russia, but they're getting closer to the US too. It's like they're trying to do two things at once.
They are. India is trying to keep everyone happy. They need Russia for weapons and energy, but they also don't want to upset the West, especially because their economies are so connected.
It sounds like things are getting more complicated globally. You mentioned before that the old rules are changing. What does that mean for the average person? How does all this affect our daily lives?
It affects us more than we might think. Take the global economy, for example. The conflict in Ukraine has already messed up supply chains, which means higher prices for everything, like food and gas.
It's not just about prices either. These changing alliances could make things less safe globally. If China and Russia are getting closer, does that mean we're heading towards another Cold War where the world is divided into two sides?
It's possible, and a lot of experts are worried about it. That kind of division could lead to countries spending more on their militaries, increased tensions, and a higher risk of something setting off a bigger conflict.
That's not a good thought. Before we get too pessimistic, I want to talk about the people actually affected by this conflict. It's easy to focus on the big picture, but this war is destroying people's lives.
You're right. It's easy to forget about the individual stories of loss, displacement, and suffering when we're talking about geopolitics and strategy. We can't forget about those people.
One of the reports you sent me told the story of a young Ukrainian woman who had to leave her home with her two little kids. She talked
The
about
terror of hearing bombs, the heartbreak of leaving everything behind, the fear of not knowing what would happen to them. That same story is happening to thousands of people all over Ukraine.
And it's not just Ukrainian suffering. The sanctions against Russia are affecting everyday Russians, too. Prices are going up, jobs are being lost, and there's a sense that things are getting worse.
It shows that these conflicts have a big impact, reaching beyond just the people fighting. It affects entire countries and even the whole world.
So what happens now? Is there any chance for peace, or are things just going to keep getting worse?
That's a tough question. There aren't any simple solutions. But I think we have to start by admitting how complex things are. We need to move past the idea of good versus evil and see that everyone involved has reasons for feeling the way they do.
Are you saying it's important to be understanding? That even if we don't agree with what Russia is doing, we need to try to see their point of view?
Exactly. We can't talk to each other if we don't understand each other, and we can't find peace without talking. We have to find a way to communicate openly and honestly where everyone feels like they're being listened to and respected.
That sounds really hard, especially with all the distrust and anger right now. Is there any example of this kind of approach working in a situation this complicated?
There have been times when talking things out has helped, even in situations that seemed impossible. Think about the end of the Cold War. There was so much tension back then with both the US and the Soviet Union having nuclear weapons.
Right.
But through diplomacy negotiations and a desire to find common ground, they were able to prevent a disaster.
So you're saying there's always hope even when things look bad. That peace is possible, even if it seems impossible.
Exactly. But it takes courage, commitment, and a belief in the power of human connection. We can't give up. We have to believe in a better world and work towards it.
That's inspiring, and we all need to hear that right now. But what can we actually do as individuals to help make the world a more peaceful place?
I think it starts with educating ourselves. We have to be informed citizens who understand the problems facing the world. We need to know the history behind these conflicts, the complexity of geopolitics, and the stories of the people caught in the middle.
So you're saying knowledge is power, and the more we know about the world, the better we can make a difference.
Exactly. We can't just sit back and watch. We need to be involved in creating a better future.
Besides learning, what else can we do? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by these huge global problems. It feels like anything we do is too small to matter.
I understand that feeling. But it's important to remember that every little thing helps. We can support organizations working for peace and justice, talk to people with different opinions, and push for policies that encourage understanding and cooperation. These are all ways we can help make the world a more peaceful place.
So it's about finding ways to do good in our own communities, in our own lives.
Exactly. We're all connected, and our actions, no matter how small, can have a ripple effect.
Throughout this conversation, I keep thinking about how this conflict is like a high-stakes poker game. We've talked about Putin's strategy, the U.S.'s response, the role of other countries. But what about Ukraine? They're the ones caught in the middle of all this. What do they have going for them, and do they have a chance of coming out on top?
That's a really important question, and one that often gets overlooked when we talk about the bigger picture. The Ukrainian people are incredibly resilient and determined in the face of this invasion. They're fighting for their country, their freedom, their right to decide their own future.
They've surprised a lot of people with how well they've fought, haven't they? Not many people thought they'd be able to hold off Russia for this long.
Their bravery and tenacity have been remarkable. But they need the West to keep supporting them. Weapons, financial aid, humanitarian assistance. They need all of this to keep fighting back.
So what happens to them depends on what the global powers decide what those players at the poker table do.
To some degree, yes. But ultimately, it's the Ukrainian people who will determine their own fate. They are the ones risking their lives, fighting for their future, their spirit, their belief in their cause. That's their biggest strength.
It's a good reminder that even when things seem hopeless, hope and determination can win. But it also makes you wonder, what does victory even look like for Ukraine? What's the end goal here?
That's a question only Ukrainians can answer. But I think it's safe to say that any solution to this conflict has to include guaranteeing their sovereignty, their security, their right to choose their own path.
That brings us back to why diplomacy is so important. We have to find a way to get everyone to the table and negotiate a peaceful outcome. It's a big challenge, but like we said, there are examples of it working, and we can't give up on hope.
Absolutely. We can't stop pushing for dialogue, for understanding, for recognizing that we're all human. The stakes are too high to do anything else.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. This has been a deep dive into more than just these ATACMS missiles. We've talked about what they mean for the world, the human cost of this war, and the chance for peace.
It's complicated and things are changing all the time, but I think we've gained a better understanding of what's happening and what might happen next.
And for our listeners who've been following this, I think this deep dive has given them important information and maybe even some new ways to think about things. But before we finish, I have one last question for you.
Here.
We've talked about this idea of a new world order, a multipolar world where power is spread out more. What are the possible scenarios for this new world order, and what do they mean for global stability?
Well, that's a question that keeps a lot of people up at night. One scenario is a world where it's even harder to get countries to work together because they're all focused on their own goals. That could lead to a more divided and unstable system.
So more regional conflicts, economies breaking down, and a greater risk of war between powerful countries. That doesn't sound good.
It's not a great picture.
Yeah.
But there's a more optimistic scenario, although it would take a big change in how we think about things.
What do you mean?
We need to stop thinking that for one country to win, another has to lose. Instead, we need to start working together, realizing that we can achieve more by collaborating.
So instead of fighting over land and resources, countries would focus on problems that affect everyone, like climate change and global pandemics.
Exactly. It would mean recognizing that in this day and age, global problems need global solutions. It's not about one country calling all the shots. It's about creating a system where everyone has a voice and everyone's interests are considered.
That sounds really difficult, especially with how things are going in the world right now. Is there anything we can do to make that happen? Are there any specific actions or policies that could help?
Definitely. One important step is to strengthen international institutions like the United Nations. They need the resources and power to effectively tackle global challenges.
What else?
We also need to invest in diplomacy and conflict resolution, basically creating ways for countries to talk to each other and negotiate, even when they don't get along. That means going beyond simple solutions and black and white thinking.
It sounds like you're advocating for a more nuanced and proactive approach to foreign policy, one that recognizes the complexities of the world and prioritizes collaboration over confrontation.
You got it. The world is a messy, complicated place, and there are rarely easy answers.
You know, throughout this conversation, we've talked about so many things, the technical details of these missiles, the complexities of geopolitics, and the possibility of a new world order. But I keep coming back to one main idea: choices.
I see what you mean. At every level, individual, national, global, we're always making choices. And those choices will determine the course of history.
So it's not just about understanding what's happening, but about recognizing that we have the power to shape the world we want to live in.
Exactly. We're not just watching things happen. We're part of the story.
Yeah.
And it's up to each of us to make choices that create a more peaceful, just, and sustainable future.
Well, that's a great point to end on. This has been an amazing conversation, and I know our listeners are going to walk away with a much better understanding of this complex and ever-changing world.
It's been great talking to you about all of this. And to everyone listening out there, keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep engaging with the world. The future isn't set in stone. We're all right in the next chapter together.
And remember, even when things are uncertain and challenging, there's always hope. As long as we keep working towards a better world, as long as we believe in the power of human connection and the possibility of positive change, we can create a future we can all be proud of. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.